severe restrictions on what they could do, on their movement. Some of these restrictions imposed by Canada as part of the controlled engagement, but much more imposed by Tehran. Movements, harassment, surveillance was very difficult. And that justifies a number of countermeasures in terms of removing families, in terms of being careful with movements. But the leap from that to stopping diplomatic relations is, I don't want to say the word dishonest, but it's non-existent. Let's put it that way.
I'm wondering, then, is there a difference between, or I guess, is there a false dichotomy between engagement with a country and advocating for something? Do we, if the government is actually trying to have a different approach by seeming to be more open and opening channels of communications with countries like Iran, Russia, do you think Canadians are satisfied with the value in simply opening those channels, or is there an expectation then that that also goes hand in hand with advocating? Is that what engagement means? I guess this goes back to the question of do we have conditions, human rights conditions? I'm curious to know, Mariam, when you have your vision on how we support civil society in Iran, did you see that, are we the Canadian government in that case? Is it Canadians, or what are the roles that both Canadians and the Canadian government have in supporting civil society?
Well, Canada is a democracy. It's an open society country. So the people of Canada have to work hand in hand with the government. We can't expect the government to have all the answers. We have to encourage the government to also take action. With my activism work, I've noticed that whenever I want to get a result from, to get a government official to take action for a prisoner in Iran or a human rights case of any kind, you do have to place pressure. And there's the right type of pressure, and then there's the wrong type of pressure. So it's really just about being strategic and non-violent in your approach, and working hand in hand. The democratic countries, the people and the governments need to work hand in hand. For the Canadian government, again, it goes back to what is the purpose of re-engaging, because we have Canadian values, which are human rights values. Like, what are we gaining from engaging with a regime that is a violator of human rights, especially a regime that is vulnerable and has so many factions within it and can crumble. And the more it crumbles, again, if the people in that society are weak, then what happens is extremist ideology is born out of weak societies. And so we have to stop that from happening. We have to strengthen Iranian civil society. It's to Canada's advantage to see the Iranian people as a strategic partner for peaceful coexistence in the Middle East region, not the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is one of the main reasons for the regional instability in the Middle East.
So if the question is, what are we trying to accomplish, is the first step reopening the embassy? Can that be done while we're still figuring out how far, what else, what we're doing in the larger picture? You mentioned the two options of, delisting Iran or proceeding with Iran still on the list. What do you think is realistic?
Well, if I had to make a prediction, and predictions, especially more than a few months out, are difficult, but I would absolutely not be surprised that at the end of the Liberal mandate in 2019, there will not be a Canadian embassy in Tehran, because of the reasons that I mentioned. I could be wrong. I certainly hope that I'm wrong, as I said at the beginning, but it is so complicated, largely because of the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act and all the implications that flow from that. And in the context of this being a complicated problem that is not a priority for the two sides to solve, I wouldn't be surprised if in 2019, when we go into elections, there's no Canadian embassy in Iran. I see that as a more likely than not scenario. That doesn't mean that Canada's other interests in Iran that I mentioned, the trade, the consular, the diplomatic, the strategic, that they can't partly be pursued without an embassy. We can do some things without an embassy. Diplomats in the region can go, our Canadian businessmen can go, and Michael mentioned the delegation of Iranian MPs here. Stuff can happen without an embassy on the ground, but it is significantly slowed down. It is made more difficult. In the case of trade, which I think is one of the, if not the key interest we have in Iran, even though I would agree that there will never be large amounts of trade between Canada and Iran. The Iranian business environment is difficult. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of red tape, there are a lot of sanctions remaining, right? Far from all the sanctions have been removed or lifted as per the nuclear deal. There are American sanctions, there's a lot of opacity in terms of the ability to pursue dollar transactions with Iran because of remaining sanctions and so on. So for Canadian businesses to pursue opportunities in Iran is made very difficult because of this environment. Sanctions, corruption, red tape, difficulty in identifying partners that are not too related to the IRGC, or you hope not too much. So without an embassy on the ground, that's not impossible, but it's much more difficult. Same thing for consular cases, but as we saw, Huma Hudfar's case was resolved. So you can achieve certain things without an embassy on the ground, but it is just made much more difficult.
Michael, what do you see as realistically what we may see going forward?
I mean, very little. I mean, I think that what we can accomplish is limited. I think that if we can make it easier for Iranian Canadians to travel back and forth to Iran, that is an accomplishment in itself. Bring over sick relatives, I mean, those sort of day-to-day, mundane, unexciting things. I think that's a realistic accomplishment. I don't think, we're going to radically change the culture of human rights in Iran. I do think we should keep pecking away at that wall with the clear-headed realization that it's a long and slow process and what we can accomplish is limited. I absolutely agree with Marianne about the importance of strengthening civil society. I think we can do that through, and we have to be careful here because you don't want to tar democratic activists and dissidents with the brush of being, Western stooges, which the regime will and has jumped all over. That said, we have a wonderful example of a functioning democracy to share. I mean, I think that scholarships for Iranian students will pay dividends decades to come. There are other things, that we've tried in other dictatorial regimes in Eastern Europe, in Africa, trying to strengthening media initiatives, for example. Digital diplomacy, again, has been tried with mixed results. But these are the sort of things that lay the foundation, hopefully, for a transition to a more decent and hopefully democratic society down the road. Because I think a bottom line is, and this is important for, I think, a lot of people to remember, and especially perhaps people like me, revolutions are very rarely bloodless. And I hope that Iran has the sort of government that the Iranian people deserve one day. I think that will come about with more enduring results and with a lot less misery through a more gradual reform. And it kind of sticks in my mouth to say that because I don't want to legitimize a lot of phony reformists within the Iranian government. I mean, there are things that are fundamentally wrong, I believe, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. But again, the sort of regime change, revolutionary changes, inevitably or almost inevitably in history, are accompanied by just an enormous amount of suffering. So I think that strengthening the sort of civil society elements in Iran, laying that foundation for a transition, I think is probably the more pragmatic but still a principled approach to take in terms of what might be achievable. But again, these are small, what we can do is limited.
It can be discouraging though to think of exchange that's happening maybe on a civil society level, whether it's academic institutions or otherwise, and having, for instance, students returning to Iran and then getting imprisoned because the regime hasn't changed. What about other mechanisms? For instance, what would you, how important are UN resolutions, for instance, in your view, Miriam?
The UN resolutions are symbolically, they're very, very important. And we have human rights advocates who spent a lot of time and energy to get the human rights resolution passed. It just recently passed. Unfortunately, you're not going to see any significant human rights improvements in Iran through these resolutions, but symbolically they mean a lot. I mean, imagine if the human rights resolution was not passed. This means that the UN will not follow a human rights mandate for Iran. So it's very dangerous, and it really, again, the most dangerous thing is when the Iranian people are alone. So Iranian people are alone. So I agree with Michael. I mean, I try to be an optimist. I've been doing this for 7 years every day, and I've been trying to be an optimist every day. But we don't want to be naive as well in terms of thinking that it's possible through engagement to improve the human rights situation in Iran. So, but what we can do is just pay attention to the human rights situation in Iran, talk about the political prisoners, let them know that they're not alone. Imagine if Justin Trudeau mentioned Saeed Malikpour's name once. Did you know that he has not mentioned Saeed Malikpour's name once since he became the Prime Minister? Neither has Minister Dion. Saeed Malikpour has been in prison, hostage of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps since 2008. And that's just, why have they not mentioned his name once? So this is what I'm talking about. It just, okay, the Iranian people, they voted for Mr. Rouhani because he had, in his election campaign, he promised human rights improvements. He promised the release of political prisoners. Of course, he did not deliver on any of his human rights promises, but that's why the people voted for him. A lot of people who wanted to boycott the election of 2003 presidential election, they decided to participate because of Mr. Rouhani's promises. So this shows us that, for the Iranian people, the human rights is #1 for them. So we have to show them that they're not alone. The more we show them that, the more confident they will get. Imagine if you're suffering and someone is showing you love and attention, does that not give you confidence and motivation to keep on going and give you hope? Well, Iranian people are just like me and you. They're human beings, and when they lack confidence and we show them that they're not alone and we're going to stand with them, then that's going to give them confidence to continue going, and it's going to give them hope and show them that their life is worth something, and this regime that takes away all their rights is not all that they deserve, because that's what they feel right now. So I think just giving them moral support will help strengthen the Iranian civil society tremendously, and unfortunately we have not seen that yet. So no government has actually taken this approach yet. So we cannot say for sure, is this going to work or not? No one has actually ever attempted it. So I think that Canada, who is usually a leader of this human rights resolution, should try this approach and see where it leads.
Before I open it up to questions, I will ask my last question to you, Thomas, and that is, I think we're going to hear a lot of questions with a very similar framing around the comparison between Trudeau and Trump, and whether there's an opportunity for Canada, whether there's going to be an extra challenge. Maybe both of those are true, but I think we're going to hear that a lot on a lot of different issues. So I'm going to jump on it before we hear it to death. But when it comes to Iran, I mean, obviously Trump has already said, whether or not he actually can get rid of the nuclear deal, which he probably can't, but at least that tensions may arise there. Does that represent more of a challenge then for Canada, do you think, or on the flip side? an opportunity to show the difference in policy?
That's a really good question. I think the first point to make, and that's a bit of a disappointing point, is that we don't know. And this is, as this has been widely said, it's not an original point, but there's so much uncertainty around what Trump will do with regards to Iran or with regards to basically anything else that we don't know. That being said, it is possible to try to be a bit more maybe original than that. I think a second point to make then is that I don't think whatever it is that Trump does, that it fundamentally changes the basics of my argument. And as I was revising this presentation, I didn't insert the word Trump because I think my basic argument doesn't change whether it's a Clinton or Trump administration, and then whatever it is that Trump actually does, because we don't know. Then the question is, what will Trump do? As on pretty much every other issue, he has been widely inconsistent. On the issue of Iran, he's talked about ripping up the deal. He's talked about renegotiating it to the US's advantage, whatever that means. And then more recently, like on many other issues, he's tried to tone it down a bit. His 2.5-minute YouTube video from last night, or the night before, I think it was last night, he said that he would withdraw the US from the TPP and a few other things. He didn't mention the Iran deal. So maybe not a priority, but it's still interesting that he did mention it. Can he actually rip up the Iran nuclear deal? I don't know what that means in terms of procedure. There's no button that says rip up. He could walk away from it and lead to its inevitable collapse, so that's a possibility. I actually think that's more unlikely as a scenario. A second thing he could do would be to try to force a renegotiation. I also don't know how he does that because, as has been widely said, it's not a bilateral deal between the US and Iran. It's an annex to a UN Security Council resolution endorsed not only by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, but also Germany. Most of these other countries, in addition to Iran, are not interested in renegotiating. So where that option goes is not clear at all. A third scenario, which has been mentioned recently by Trump surrogates, which increasingly I see as the most likely, and this is where there can be some implications for Canada, is that he actually leaves the deal as is, so status quo, but he toughens up enforcement, and he tries to tighten up sanctions that are non-nuclear related, right? The nuclear deal called for a lifting of nuclear-related sanctions, but human rights, missiles, terrorism support, these sanctions are all still there. There is scope, without violating the letter of the deal, maybe the spirit, that depends on who speaks, without violating the letter of the deal, to toughen up some of the other sanctions and to toughen up enforcement. To give you an example of what that could mean, last week the IAEA reported that Iran exceeded by 0.1 ton, which is less than 0.1%, its allotted amount of heavy water that it can keep. Heavy water, not good at this stuff, but it's to cool down reactors that produce plutonium. This is, technically speaking, a violation of the nuclear deal, right? Iran violated the deal last week. In practice, who cares? Because this is less than 1.1%, but it is a violation. So Trump could, and this is, I think, the second time that this happened, if I'm not mistaken. So Trump could, next time this happened, or pick up on this one, and then call for a violation, toughen up enforcement, and start a process that would at least weaken the deal and perhaps break it. What does this all mean for Canada? In practice, not that much, because we're not a party to the deal, we are not present in Iran, we still don't have an embassy, our trade has really not picked up yet. So does this allow Canada to position itself as sort of an intermediary between Trump and Iran? Frankly, I don't see that. I mean, there's always people in Canada who will be the first to say we should be an honest broker, we should be a mediator. Most of the time we say that and nothing actually happens. In the case of Iran, I really don't see how we could position ourselves as a mediator. First of all, we're not there. It's hard to be a mediator when you're not there. And in any case, I don't really see Iran being willing to accept a mediation role for Canada in front of a country like Germany or other European countries or Oman or Qatar or Kuwait. And so ultimately, whatever scenario you take for, and I'm sorry this answer was a bit long, but Trump, to keep it short, I don't see how it fundamentally changes Canada's capitalism.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's open it up to questions. If you don't mind giving your name and any affiliation you'd like to give, and then posing your question. I guess I'll go around with this mic, and or I'll pass the mic to go around. Thank you.
Feel free to ask a question in French as well if you'd like.
Hi there, my name is Garnet Tennis. I'm a member of Parliament. Thank you for the presentations, fascinating. Two questions I wanted to ask. First, some concern about if we were to reestablish diplomatic relations, what the Iranian embassy would do here. Obviously, activity at the Chinese embassy, the Turkish embassy raises concern for human rights activists here in Canada. So I wonder what the implications for that would be. And the second question, just so the situation in Yemen. I wonder if you can just comment on Iranian involvement in Yemen. And I don't know if anyone has a lot of expertise on that, but if you think the Houthi rebels sort of are extractable from the Iranian orbit or not, and what the conditions could be for a peace deal or not. Thanks.
Two very good questions. First of all, and would an Iranian embassy here engage in nefarious activities? Nefarious being a word that you associate with a country you don't like, right? Even though everybody else does it. So yes, they would, because that's what embassies do. It's normal. We don't like it. We have to try to counter it. We have to expect it, but it's normal. So is it a reason, is it something to be suspicious about? Of course. Is it something to prepare for and mitigate? Of course, but it's not a reason not to do it, because that's just normal. On the issue of Yemen, I'm really happy you asked that, which is, Yemen is sort of my second preferred country in the region. I studied there for a while, a few years ago, and I just wrote earlier this year on Iran's role in Yemen. So again, I'll try to keep it short, try to do better than the previous one. The idea that Iran controls the Houthis, or that Iran has invaded a fourth Arab country in Yemen, is complete nonsense. It's something that Saudi Arabia has used to justify its intervention in Yemen, which it has for other reasons, and I don't want to defend Saudi Arabia's actions, massive war crimes, strategically stupid, to be blunt. But it is not true that Iran controls the Houthis. Iran only recently started providing limited support to the Houthis. It is not large. It doesn't fundamentally change the balance of forces on the ground. Iran's support for Hezbollah, or for Assad, as was said, has a major impact in the Lebanese theater, in Syria, in Iraq in some cases, not in Yemen. Yemen is nowhere near, in terms of importance of Iranian penetration, where these other countries are. So Yemen, Iran probably deserves a limited say in whenever peace comes to Yemen. I'm not optimistic at all on that. But Iran doesn't pull strings of the Houthis. The Houthis are not proxies of Iran, nowhere near. The Houthis don't respond to Iran. They don't obey Iranian command and control or anything like that.
I mean, just briefly, I agree with Thomas. We know when Iran had an embassy here, they were supposedly limited by there was a limitations that they couldn't have cultural organizations or consulates or anything outside of Ottawa, for example. It was supposed to be limited to discussions of Zarek Hazmi and a couple other things. We know they violated that. They had a front cultural organization in North Toronto, which was disguised as something else. We know that the student groups, actually right here in Carleton, the Iranian Students Association in Carleton was soliciting money from the office of the Iranian president. This was back under Ahmadinejad. That went on. There were conferences again where the connection to the Iranian embassy was disguised. So is that nefarious? I guess it was a violation of the agreement. Some of those things I outlined were a violation of the agreement or the rules that Canada imposed. That said, Canada was consistently uninterested in doing anything about it, so I'm not sure how strongly they felt about the rules that they had outlined. So there is a precedent. I suppose it would depend on the nature of the re-engagement that's established the second time around. But there is a history of I think it's fair to say, dishonesty on the part of Iranian diplomatic staff here.
Or behaving normal.
Or behaving normally, yeah. We all, they were acting, the diplomats were acting like diplomats, I guess, is a fair way to say it.
Anyone else?
Hi, my question's for Miriam. You spoke a lot about civil society, and I completely agree with you that that's something that we need to work on improving in Iran. But what concrete steps can Canada take beyond just rhetorical measures to help strengthen civil society in Iran?
Thank you. So the Canadian government itself can do very simple things, like just release statements about political prisoners or about the Baha'i community, for instance, right? They're largely persecuted, and under Rouhani, their situation has not improved even a little bit. So, you know, the Canadian government needs to be very vocal and just keep tabs on the human rights situation. Especially, again, Saeed Malikpour is a Canada-linked prisoner. You know, they have not released even one statement with his name in it. Even when Ms. Homa Hoodfar was released, and even before her, we had a permanent resident released, Mr. Mostafa Azizi. When both of them were released, Canada released statements and didn't mention Saeed Malikpour. That's an optimal opportunity just to mention his name, and they didn't. So just simply releasing statements, Canada can give a lot of confidence to the Iranian people. We saw back like maybe a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, Barack Obama, when he mentioned a political prisoner in one of his speeches, that prisoner was released a couple of months later. So it's very, very powerful when a Canadian authority talks about a prisoner. Regular Canadian citizens can push their parliament members to speak out in parliament about prisoners. There's a petition that that the Canadian government offers you, and if you, I think it's about 25 or 50 signatures you collect, you take it to your local parliament member, and then they'll read that petition in the parliament. So there's little things we can do, or we can just mobilize ourselves and just start campaigns for political prisoners or the situation of religious minorities in Iran or ethnic minorities, and just talk about it. And just talking about it itself is enough. Or support Iranian human rights activists, such as myself. I'm working on a project right now, and I am looking for help and volunteers, and you don't need to be Iranian to help. So it's just supporting initiatives that already exist, and also pressuring your government in the right nonviolent way to take action in terms of writing statements or just speaking out for political prisoners in Iran.
Hi folks, thanks for having this discussion tonight. My name is David Sweet, Member of Parliament. I've sat on the Subcommittee for International Human Rights for the last 10 plus years. We've instituted an Iran Accountability Week actually over the last 5 years, trying to focus on not only human rights threat, but the nuclear threat that Iran poses, the fact that the export terror, this regime, I could go on all night. But I wanted to say thank you for all of your advocacy, Miriam. You don't need to really pressure us too much. One of the things that we really need as individual members of Parliament is just for to know about prisoners. You can imagine that we hear of tens of thousands of human rights cases, so we just need to be informed. The Baha'i community does have a good connection with us, and they inform us quite frequently, and we've actually had emergency debates that have lasted into the evening in that regard. So please do keep us informed. There's lots of things that are always going on. Sometimes there's so many cases that we lose track of some, but by the way, you were talking about Saeed, and it's on Twitter now, and making sure that we hold our government to account, and because I am an opposition member, and to do that and to keep it that they understand that we're conscious of it, and we've seen results when we do that. So thank you very much for having this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Any others? No. Well, I'm going to ask maybe one final question, but feel free if anyone has another. But it seems in this discussion that this is already slow going, but the government has announced, it has announced that it does want to re-engage. So what now? What happens if we come to the end of 4 years and we don't have an embassy there, but there's been a lot of talk about it? Do we care? Do we hold, this is kind of the big question around campaign promises, but especially when it comes to the framing of re-engagement with Iran, and whether it's genuine or not, being talked about as a human rights issue, or that there's concern for human rights. What happens if that just doesn't happen? Do we care about that? How do we, whether it's holding the government accountable or saying, this is something that you've promised to do, what then?
Well, complete isolation of the Iranian regime, I mean, there's different strategies. I can't say that's completely wrong or, re-engaging is completely right. But, if you look at North Korea, for instance, they're completely isolated and the human rights situation in North Korea is not improving whatsoever. So, I mean, you do need to have some influence in the country to make moves and make a difference. But again, if you're going to re-engage, you have to make sure that you're talking about the human rights situation. If you ignore the human rights situation and just engage for economic gain or whatnot, then you're not going to be productive in any way, and it's really not going to lead anywhere. I think that the Iranian Canadian community is going to push for the opening of the embassy. I mean, unless there's strong consular services available for the people. I mean, the Iranian people, they just, as long as they have consular services, I think that they're not they're not adamant they're not pushing for the embassy to be open because they want, I mean, it's to the regime's advantage for the embassy to be open too. The people really just want consular services. But again, having the embassy allows the Canadian authorities to push for the human rights agenda. So if the embassy is going to open for the purpose of pushing the human rights agenda, then I'm all for it. But if it's to ignore the human rights agenda and push for some economic gain, again, Canada doesn't have that much economic interest in Iran anyway, then it doesn't really make sense. There has to be a purpose for re-engagement. That's why I started by saying, what is the purpose of re-engagement? We have to figure that out first.
Ali Sassy, can I put you on the spot? I know
Sure.
Well, Mr. Sassy
I
has
didn't think it was
it.
gonna work that way, but sure.
No, I know, and you're good to come. I know one shouldn't make generalizations about an entire ethnic group, but I'm going to. I think that Iranians have strongly held political opinions. I think it is fair to say, and I think Mr. Sassy, as an Iranian Canadian MP in a riding with a lot of Iranian Canadians, has a difficult job balancing these, and I haven't made your job any easier as a journalist, but I'm going to make it more difficult again, because I'd like to hear from you what you would consider a minimum benchmark of success regarding relations with Iran, say at the end of this mandate. Is that something you would mind addressing, or?
Sure, I think it's a fluid situation, obviously. Sure, absolutely. I truly wasn't expecting to get any questions. I think it's a very difficult relationship. There's no doubt about it. And of course, it will all depend on what the Iranians demand, what they find acceptable. So, we can't just expect the Canadian government to go in there and have its own benchmarks. It's something that would require buy-in from the Iranian side. So, given the factionalism that has become a mainstay of the Iranian regime, who knows? Those things change. And I'm not entirely certain that the Iranian government actually has any idea as to whether they would find this to be favorable or not. So we'll see. I think it's important to have those lines open, but unless there is agreement on both sides and it's deemed acceptable, I don't think we're going to see an Iranian embassy here or vice versa.
Just a quick response to your question. If there's no embassy in 2019, first of all, it's not a big deal. Like I said, it would be nice if we had one, but it's not a big priority for Canada. So the loss to Canada would be real, but it would be very limited. So we would have other problems, especially given what's going on south of the border. What do? We keep trying, because it is in our interest to have an embassy. Do we hold the Liberals accountable? No, we hold the Conservatives accountable, because it is their legacy that has done the most to prevent an embassy from happening. So they are the ones that should be held accountable for the major difficulty of opening an embassy, not the Liberals. They are genuinely trying, as I said. What do? We try to find a compromise, maybe. Politics is the art of the possible. If it is too difficult to open an embassy, given the constraints that I mentioned, what is a middle way? Is it opening a Canadian interest section in Tehran? Is it opening some kind of office that doesn't have full diplomatic status, that at least allows us to pursue consular interests, to give at least some support to Canadian businesses in Iran without having the full presence of an embassy? Maybe that's at least for a while, and I think as an interim solution it could last for a number of years.
Hi there, David Lechon here, alumni at university. I was wondering if we could go a bit more into the case of Saeed Malakpour. It seems that there's a discrepancy between what the panel's perspective on the level of exposure he's had as compared to our MPs. Is he, I believe I heard he's the only Canadian citizen presently in prison in Iran?
He's the only Canada-linked prisoner in Iran. He's actually a permanent resident. Saeed Malakpour he had pretty much a year left before he could apply for qualify to apply for citizenship. He was living in Victoria, BC, and he was a freelance web programmer. And so, you know, if Saeed Malakpour never went to Iran to visit his dying father, and if he was not kidnapped off the streets the third day in Tehran, and if he has not been in prison for the past 8 years, he would have already been a Canadian citizen for the past 5 years. So we have to keep that in mind. And so before the Trudeau government, Saeed Malakpour was sentenced to death for moderating pornographic websites. That's what the regime claims, with no evidence other than forced confessions extracted under torture.